Well, good afternoon, I guess it is. Welcome to the lecture on chapter 7. We will do the lecture part today, and then on Thursday or Friday, we will follow up with a trip through chapter 7, where we basically go page by page and pick up a few added extra uh, points and suggestions for understanding utilitarianism. As I get started today, I want to, first of all, pull up a photograph here. So I'm going to share this screen with you. This is our good friend Jeremy Bentham, and it's a long story to good old Jerry. Of course, we will be covering him today, but Jerry was an entrepreneur back in the 18th century. He founded London College, University of London, and it was a very egalitarian place at that time at Cambridge and I can't remember what the other Oxford. Women were not permitted in class, and Jeremy instituted college education for women. And also, for the most part, if you weren't if your parents your father hadn't graduated from Oxford or Cambridge, or you weren't royalty, you simply didn't go to college. And he opened up university studies to working class people. He was a very wealthy man, and he left all of his fortune to his university under the understanding that he would be present for all board meetings. And so in order to keep his millions of pounds, the university stuffed him. So here you see Bentham stuffed in his little cabinet, where he remains today. I do think that he made an American tour not too many years ago, where his cabinet was transported, I think Chicago, New York, some of the stop-off places. But his head deteriorating. You see the head there between his feet. The head deteriorated, and they made a wax copy of his head. Later on, his head was stolen, as I recall, and held hostage by a soccer team, football team from another university. So good old-fashioned college fun. So that's our Jeremy Bentham. Kind of grotesque and ghoulish, but then we are approaching Halloween, aren't we? So I thought that might enliven your day. So we're going to switch here from looking at good old Mr. Bentham to sharing our screen for today's lecture. So here we go. Now, please recall that we use the word utilitarianism and consequentialism in exchange with each other. They basically mean the same thing. I do want also to remind you, and I will when we begin the the dive into the chapter itself, I'll remind you once again, but it's very important that you go back before you read the section on utilitarianism, chapter 7, go back to the very beginning of our textbook. In the hard copy of the textbook, it is on pages 6 and 7. The traits of moral principles. It's right after the discussion of the differences between religion, law, etiquette. So it's right after that. And you want to review the traits of moral principles. Now, this is more important for some of you than others because several missed this question on the exam. You confused this part of the textbook with the let's see, under moral objectivism, the three, what he calls where he calls principles. These are the three principles of moral objectivism. Some of you confuse those two pages. And I'll remind you once again that when the exam is concerned, we go from page 1 to the end. I don't skip around. So you wouldn't, if you're answering questions on the first chapter, you wouldn't want to go forward to the third chapter because the answer is the closest to the beginning. All right, so review those traits of moral theory. Now, we're talking about utilitarianism, and as we'll discover later, Bentham probably is the only utilitarianism. Now, Professor Poyman is not going to tell you that, but John Stuart Mill was a classically trained philosopher. His father taught him very well. Bentham was not. Bentham was an attorney by trade, although he never practiced, but he was a very wealthy man. He made his livelihood in a very lucrative business. So he's not a trained philosopher. He doesn't know the history of philosophy. He's not really terribly interested in what we would call moral theory. He's more of a legal or political entity. So he was an English barrister. They would prefer that term rather than attorney. Although he never practiced law, he was, in English terms, called to the bar. We would say he passed his bar exam. So he was a very wealthy individual, and John Stuart Mill's father, James Mill, was Bentham's secretary. So John Stuart, who is our main interest in chapter 7, would have been under the influence of Bentham from a very early age. And as a matter of fact, his education and his way in life was mostly financed by Bentham. Also, a note here, again, as I discussed above, that he founded University College London and admitted women and working class individuals from the founding of that university, and was in charge of the board of directors. And in order to keep his money, they have always kept him stuffed and in the boardroom for the board meetings. Now, Bentham is purely interested in pain versus pleasure. For him, the worst thing in the world is pain. So we will go to strong ends, according to Bentham, and we should, to minimize the amount of pain in our life. And I've got this quote here from an introduction to the principles of morals and education. Nature has placed humankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do, as well as to determine what we shall do. On the one hand, the standard of right and wrong. On the other, the chain of causes and effects are fastened to their throne. They govern us in all we do, in all we say, and in all we think. So it's the maximization of pleasure and the minimization of pain that rules individual lives as well as life together. Now, Poyman mentions Bentham's hedonistic calculus, and that's the term that it's gathered, from early discussions. But it's not really a hedonistic calculus. I loved calculus, but most of you didn't. Calculus is a difficult topic for many people, but rest assured, you need not run in fear from Bentham's so-called hedonistic calculus, because it's really more of a hedonistic simple arithmetic. And I've done a little of the math here, shall we say. If we're trying to decide between pizza and ice cream, what would give us the most pleasure? If we individually or corporately think that pizza at this point in our life would give us just a little bit less pleasure than ice cream, say it's 1 versus 2, then we jot down 2. Perhaps at another point in time, we discuss pizza maybe has 3 interests. Even if we take a vote on that, for instance, in our class, were we able to, should we meet together ever again? So we got 3 versus 6. Now this works for individual as well as social situations. So when we total up the number of desires for pizza versus ice cream, we've got 4 versus 8. So ice cream simply is the rule of the day. It's ice cream that we're going to partake of or seek out. So that's the hedonistic calculus. Very simple way of deciding what it is we're going to do as a society or as an individual, whether we're going to go out for pizza tonight or ice cream. I would prefer to do both, but we're talking about the calculus here, or the arithmetic. Now, so that's in simple terms what we're talking about when we talk about the hedonistic calculus. One of the other interesting things about Bentham is that, for the most part, whether we're talking Plato, Aristotle, Mill even, or Kant, the ability to reason, St. Thomas, of course, for sure, the ability to reason is what makes a moral agent. So the capacity for intelligence and thought is the key to an individual. Bentham looks at that just a little bit differently. And this, other people have turned this into some interesting work. But for Bentham, the ability to suffer, and not necessarily what we would call higher reason, was the basis for his moral measures. So he would have entertained an early concept of the rights of animals, for instance, in this regard, since animals obviously suffer. So he would make animals a moral agent in the sense that they were capable of suffering. And any entity capable of suffering would be accorded some degree of moral autonomy for Bentham. I'll leave you to think about that. I find that intriguing about him, and we might certainly want to work that up into to our moral theory. So let's move on to Mill, because Mill is far more interesting, far more philosophical, and in many ways far more influential historically than was Bentham. So Mill was a classically trained philosopher by his father. This young man was reading Greek and Latin at the age of 4, 5, or 6, before many of us are reading and writing our native languages. So he read Plato and Aristotle, and actually, I think either wrote a paper or a book on Diogenes Laertius. By the way, Diogenes is roughly equivalent in time to Socrates, and Diogenes was one of the most interesting people in the history of philosophy. He was a cynic. He and his followers didn't believe in anything that was, shall we say, unnatural. He didn't bathe. He didn't dress. He ran around naked and dirty all of the time. As a matter of fact, the story in Aristotle is that he was known for carrying a lantern in the daytime because he was looking for an honest man. So wherever he went, he was looking for people who were like him, honest. There are lots of stories about Diogenes. One of them is that he was attending a lecture by Parmenides. Remember, now Parmenides' metaphysics says that change is impossible. Whereupon Diogenes was sitting in the corner, and he got up and moved to sit to the other corner, which was his proof, right, that change had happened. There are other stories about him. One of the most interesting is some Greek workers were carrying a series of pieces of lumber down the street on their shoulders, and as Diogenes and his disciples passed, all naked and dirty, they were so taken by the spectacle that they turned around quickly, and of course they had the length of 2x4, shall we say, behind them, and when they did, they slapped Diogenes up beside the head, and they ran over to him and yelled, "Be careful!" To which Diogenes said, "Why, are you going to hit me again?" So anyway, he was a character. And Mill did a significant amount of research on Diogenes. But even though he was a classically trained philosopher and trained in the classics, Greek and Latin literature, like his mentor Bentham, he made his fortune in business. He was head of the British East India Company for much of the 19th century. And even though he was raised and trained in London, he lived much of his life and died in his beloved Avignon, France, in 1873. Now, Mill, unlike Bentham, although Bentham was a true political liberal, but this is not what I'm talking about. Mill is part of what's called the classical liberal tradition. And I don't mean our current notion of liberal, because in the classic liberal tradition, both what we call conservative today and liberal would have been part of this classic liberal tradition. So the West, the European and American West, at least, is by definition in its science and in its philosophy classically liberal. Now, I don't care what you call yourself by your political party. By the definition, you're part of classical liberalism. That's just the way it's turned out. The classical liberal tradition, in many ways, rules Western thought. And this goes all the way back to the Greeks. So Mill had this classical liberal traditional assumptions, and he held that in common with the Greeks that were 2,000 years before him. And as we are going to see, especially later on, because we're turning to Immanuel Kant in the next chapter, Immanuel Kant is in many ways the quintessential statement about the classical liberal tradition, and he shares many of the same concept aspects, tendencies to Immanuel Kant, who was 100 years before him. And as I've said here, almost the entirety of Western philosophical and cultural tradition. Now, what is classical liberal tradition? Okay, I've said here, in general, the classical liberal tradition upholds a basic form of the assumption that humanity reaches its full potential through some form of education or personal betterment. Now, Plato invents this scheme. Plato establishes this tradition in the Republic. Well, actually, even before the Republic, by the Crito and the Phaedo, is already arguing this. He argues that no one chooses evil intentionally. In other words, evil is not a willful act in Plato. We do evil things simply because we are uneducated. We don't know better. So for Plato, moral weakness can be viewed as a form of ignorance, like not knowing how to overcome one's intemperance or being blinded by pain or passion, perceivable only to us. Doing the wrong thing may seem like the only option and not a choice at all. So if a person is aware that they are acting wrongly, but unaware of how to overcome internal or external factors affecting them, this forces them to take this course of action. They're doing it out of ignorance and not because they choose to harm themselves. In other words, there's, in the classical liberal tradition, unlike Judeo-Christian tradition, this sense of sin is ameliorated or lessened. So no one really makes a conscious decision to do the wrong thing. One simply acts out of ignorance. All of classical liberalism, most of philosophical tradition, most of the way the West thinks is based on some form of this assumption that education or personal betterment is the key to private and corporate thriving. It's the way you make yourself better. It's the way you make culture or society better. Now, Mill's part of this tradition. Mill borrows from Plato, Aristotle, Epicurus, and that I hope you've read, and Kant. Now he comes to Kant, I think, through French influences, because the Enlightenment in France and Germany is far more impactful than it was in England. The English Enlightenment never really took full flower as it did on the continent. So I think, in my personal understanding of this, Mill probably comes to his theories about Kant, or employs the sort of Kantian exegesis or Kantian analysis that he does because of his French connections. That's just my thoughts on this. Uh, as you're going to see as you read this chapter, there's act utilitarianism and then there's rule utilitarianism. And act utilitarianism is a sort of bridge between Bentham and Mill. Although Mill came to quickly understand that act utilitarianism simply by itself would not work. And I think that's when he begins to pull in some of these French and German Enlightenment influences. And you're going to find, I think, as you read this chapter, and then as you read the chapter on Kant, the rule utilitarianism that Mill talks about in this chapter is almost a direct copy of the basic form of Kantian deontology that we'll study in the next chapter. So this is borrowed from Kant. I mean, he's well educated across the whole gamut of Western society, so he's pulling in these influences from Plato, Aristotle, and then Kant. And that's how I think he comes to understand that some sort of rule utilitarianism is necessary if we are to really make sense of the greatest good for the greatest number. He firstly makes a qualitative move. So for Mill, it's the quality of the pleasure, not the quantity of the pleasure. Please remember that as you read this chapter. And then the next movement, the next evolution, shall we say, of his understanding of utilitarianism is that not only must there be quality, but this quality itself must be ensconced, must be embedded in certain rules that are incontrovertible, like don't kill, don't murder, etc. So his rule utilitarianism becomes then a shadow of the basic form of Kantian deontology that we're going to pick up in chapter 7. The only way to have a philosophical rule is through the inculcation, the drawing in of personal excellence, such as Kant's assertion that there is nothing good but a good will. That would be Kant's definition. Or the role of arete. We've covered this before, and I don't forget that, because arete is translated as virtue, but that's a very poor translation. It really, in Plato and Aristotle both, means excellence. It is what makes an individual, is the striving for this excellence. And that's what the teacher, Socrates, does for everyone, is to allow them to give form to this arete that lies hidden deep within them. But it's education, proper education, that brings this out, that pulls this out of the individual and makes that available in his or her own life for his or her own personal betterment, and also for the use of society in terms of work and education and the excellence that we employ in everyday affairs. So even though he was not a thoroughgoing utilitarian like his mentor, Bentham, his moral theory is much more robust because it pulls from this great tradition and it makes sense of the utilitarian principle within this great tradition. And that's what makes Mill, as compared to Bentham and Hobbes, unique and philosophical and interesting. So I hope this kind of spurs you to read with a little more gusto this chapter and to think about how the greatest good for the greatest number can become an imperative, and how we might control mob rule, because I think that one of the things that troubles Mill is, well, as a matter of fact, that even during Bentham's, when Bentham was alive, his philosophy was called a pig philosophy, because a pig wallowing is just interested in her own little place in the mud. So somehow we must get beyond the personal, the relative, and that's what Mill wants to do. Mill is also very concerned about how and it occurs to him, it doesn't occur to Bentham, but it occurs to Mill to be very concerned about what the majority might do. And so he begins to have concern about the rule of a majority. As a matter of fact, at one point, I'm not sure if it happens in this edition of Poemen's textbook, but at one point, Poemen quoted Heinrich Ibsen, the great Danish playwright, where he said that the worst thing in the world was what he called the damned compact majority, where 51% of the people could lay waste to 49% of the people simply on a percentage vote. I think they could under Bentham, but Mill wants to add, number one, quality. So he wants the measure of pleasure to be higher. So he wants a quality kind of pleasure, and that's the reason he goes to intellectual pleasures are better than just personal hedonistic pleasures. And the second thing about fairness, I think, is why he brings in rule utilitarianism, to prevent that damned compact majority from wasting the lives of a large minority. So those are some concerns to think about as you read through this chapter. Is Mill successful in preventing that tyranny, the tyranny of the majority? I'll leave you to think about that, and I hope you will. And come Thursday, I'll schedule a Zoom meeting, and hopefully you can be present for us to go through the chapter together, and you can ask me particular questions about things that might trouble you as you're reading this chapter. So I hope that things go well for you, and this will be on YouTube pretty soon. So take care, and I'll see you Thursday or Friday.